Hey all, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and this one I'm going over my round 3 game from the Marshall GMIM Invitational. Now, if you followed the first 2 rounds, you know I got off to 2 draws against International Masters Brandon Jacobson and David Brodsky, and this one I had the white piece again and was hoping to show a better effort than I did in my first round game because my first round game with white was dreadful. My opponent here was International Master Levy Rozman, a staple in the New York City chess scene, actually a full-time chess coach now, I believe, and I believe he does a lot of coaching and a lot of streaming, also a well-known streamer on Twitch. I can't say, I think his Twitch name is Gotham Chess, but in any case, I think he's gone a lot in that direction and with a lot of success. So I don't think he's playing as many tournaments as he used to, but he's still quite active. In any case, very tough opponent, very, very formidable, great with tactics, and I was hoping to kind of challenge him here. So I had white, and I played d4. Levy played d5, knight f3, knight f6, and e3. And part of the reason I played this type of move order against Levy is because I know he had quite a lot of experience in the Queen's Gambit accepted lines. So I thought that by playing this move order with e3, that if he goes for a Queen's Gambit accepted, I'll take on c4 in one move with my bishop, and maybe he wouldn't actually go for those lines. He'd choose something different. So he played bishop g4, and when he played bishop g4, I felt, okay, maybe this is not quite a Queen's Gambit accepted anymore because now his bishop's outside of the chain, and there's benefits and drawbacks to this. Essentially, the benefit is normally the light squared bishop in queen's pawn openings is kind of weak, or at least takes a while to get going. Normally, you have to develop it through b7, and that takes some time. The drawback of getting out so early is it can actually be chased. This bishop on g4 can get chased around, and eventually, if it's chased around, normally white can win it and get the bishop pair. So I was very happy to see bishop g4. I went for c4, and after d takes c4, I saw here that he was willing to try and get his Queen's Gambitic structure anyway. I'd seen a lot of games where he'd played in this fashion, where he played d takes c4 and bishop g4, so I was ready for this. And after d takes c4, I went knight bd2. And this was basically my idea, is that instead of taking on c4 with the bishop and getting to these structures that he understood pretty well, again, I've seen him play this position with e6 many, many times. And then rattling off a quick c5. And his argument is that he has no bad pieces. He puts the pawn on c5, the knight on c6, the bishop on e7, and the bishop's already out of the chain instead of being on c8. So very logical, but I wanted to avoid that. And my idea with knight bd2 is if I'm able to recapture with the knight on c4, it's kind of annoying because this knight could jump to e5. It also controls it just does a lot of good job controlling the king side and the center, and it's a little bit of a different setup. So e6 was played anyway, and then I went knight takes e4, and this was kind of my ideal setup where the knight has really good influence over the center. Bishop b4 check was played. Makes sense, trying to punish the fact that my knight can't just go to c3 and block. And I went bishop d2, and after bishop takes d2, queen takes d2, and this was still a part of my preparation. And the idea was that I am leaving this f3 knight open, so white can potentially allow black to take it here, but the point was I thought the double pawns weren't as big an issue, and I thought my control of the center would matter more. So Levy, being a pretty principled player, decided to go for it and when bishop takes f3, g takes f3. And here we have actually quite an unbalanced position where I have pretty good control of the center with my knight and my pawn structure, and these double pawns aren't really that weak yet. But, black might be able to attack and undermine the structure with c5, and there's pretty dynamic play because now there are even circumstances where because the g file is opened, it could be potentially a strength or potentially a weakness for white. So this is the position I was aiming for, and I thought white should have something here, but it's still very, very dynamic. Black went knight c6, I think trying to justify the giving up the bishop for the knight there, and also thinking about potential e5 breaks in some positions. Like now that this knight is on c6 and my knight on f3 is gone, e5 is a little bit more sensitive than normal. Although this knight on c4 does a good job of covering the square. I decided to go bishop g2 and just prepare this bishop to be unleashed on the diagonal with f4. And this was kind of the other reason why I felt the double pawns on the f line were not such a big deal, because if the bishop gets that diagonal, I thought, white should have some pretty good Catalan-esque play. Queen d5 was played. I think that's a good move, stopping f4 from happening right away and kind of forcing me to castle kingside. A few moves back, I did not mention this, but I could have actually considered castling queenside. And there's actually a good argument for this, because my king could scoot over to b1 very quickly, where it'd be nice and tucked away. And then I could make use of the open g file with my rook. I could just go rook g1 and pressure down the g file. And then maybe after king b1, my rook scoots over to c1. I also have the half open c file to play with. So this was really a serious alternative that I maybe should have considered. I rejected it because I thought that black would be pretty much okay in these positions. I thought black could just castle kingside and go g6 and defend against the g file. And I also thought that black could consider going queen e7 and castling queenside. But in hindsight, it seems like white is kind of fast with the c file pressure. So, for instance, if if I just go rook g1 and g6, this seems like a little bit risky, because I might be able to play h4 and blast open the position. Not to mention the fact that I can go f4 and bishop g2 and get pressure here. And it seems that just with king b1, rook c1, and pressure on the c and g lines, maybe black castling kingside is very risky. So I maybe should have given it a little bit more thought than just bishop g2, but I thought, hey, this is not such a bad position. Now, rook c1 was my idea as well, and I wound up playing this move. The point is that I'm not rushing to castle queenside, and because that would actually take more time to get my rook to c1. I'd have to go king b1 afterward, and then rook d1 to c1 back. So I was like, why not just get rook c1 in one move? And so that was my rationale with that. And then on the king side, I thought, well, I'll castle queenside, and then this queen will be evicted very quickly with f4. So I thought that was a reasonable way to play. Rook d8 was played, and then I castled kingside, and black played queen h5, getting out of the way of this diagonal, and also kind of entertaining maybe putting some pressure on the h2 pawn. So, maybe if I play a move like f4 right away, knight g4 might be a mate threat. That's interesting. The other idea here is that now the queen is out of the way, you actually unleash the rook on the d file. So now e5 is also a theme in some positions, because my queen would be the pawn on the d file can't capture because my queen would be under fire. So interesting move. I went queen c2 to step away from the action, but f4 was a serious alternative. Again, the thing that actually made me a little bit wary about playing f4, believe it or not, was actually g5. Point being is that I thought that black could keep the king on e8, actually, and just play rook g8 and get a lot of pressure on the king side. And I had a feeling this wasn't correct, but it just seemed very, very dynamic and playable, and I just thought it was a tough position to handle over the board. A sample line could have gone f takes g5, queen takes, and f4, and I do have really good control in the center. I'm clamping down on this e5 break, and I'm hitting the queen with tempo, and now my queen is protecting the g2 bishop. But again, I just thought this position was a little bit double-edged, and it probably is double-edged, but just better for white, and so very, very serious alternative I could have considered. But I thought the king on e8 is relatively secure, and with the rook coming to g8, I wasn't so sure what my next few moves were. So instead of that, I went queen c2 just very modestly, not sticking my pawn out to f4 to provoke g5 and getting out of the way of an e5 break. Black castled, And now I went f4, feeling a little bit more comfortable now that the king is on g8. I thought g5 was not a realistic option anymore. And the thing I liked about f4 now is that I have a really secure clamp on the e5 pawn, on the e5 square, rather. So knight d5 was played, trying to maneuver this knight to a better square. And I went king h1, getting my king out of the line of the g file and freeing up my bishop to moves without having to deal with queen g4 check. And then a6. And a6 kind of told me that, you know, I probably have the advantage because I have a lot of space in the center. I have the half-open c file to get counterplay on. And a6 does not really change the story in the position, doesn't even contribute to dealing with any of the advantages I have. So I thought that, you know, this was kind of a waiting move that signaled to me that I really am the one in the driver's seat and black is waiting for me to do something. So I decided to play queen b3 and do something. I decided to put pressure on b7 and, you know, deal with a sensitive queen side that really is sensitive because that light squared bishop is gone. So I was hoping that with the knight in front of the c pawn, which is quite unnatural in queen's pawn openings, and with this bishop on the long diagonal, and then with my rook on the half open file, that by tickling the queen side I would get something here. Black played rook b8. I think that's a good move, covering the b7 pawn. Note that if you push the b pawn with like a move like b5, I'm happy to retreat, and now I have a whole new target, which is the c6 knight and this weak pawn on c7 to attack. And then this knight could relocate to e4 where it's beautifully placed. So pushing the b pawn is very ill-advised. So rook b8 is a you know, kind of a sad necessity. It's, you know, you don't want to put the rook there, but it makes sense. I went knight d2 anyway, retreating the knight and still, you know, keeping my eye on this half-open c-file. And then black played knight c e7, reinforcing this knight on d5, also making sure that maybe this c-pawn could potentially move to c6 and be a little bit more solid and reinforce the knight on d5, and also taking advantage of the fact that e4 is not a move here because my f4 pawn is hanging. So really I can't challenge this knight on d5 just yet. I went knight e4. I thought this was just a dream square for the knight because on from e4 can eye c5. You can eye the queen with knight g3 potentially. I thought that made a lot of sense. Black went c6 to cover this knight on d5. And now I was really unsure what my plan should be because it looks like white optically has an incredible position. Black has no useful pawn breaks. c5's out of the question. e5's out of the question. But at the same time, I don't really have an effective pawn break either because my pawn chain is pretty much, you know, secure the way it is, and I don't want to push these pawns. So it's a question of creating some weaknesses in the black camp that I could take advantage of. And now that he set up this kind of, you know, light squared blockade, if you will, it's kind of difficult to figure out what my plan is. One thought I had was to maybe double rooks on the c-file, like with going like rook c5 and trying to provoke b6, but I wasn't sure what that would garner me. Another idea was to push my a and b pawns and maybe get a minority attack with b5, and that was another option. Another way to play was to pull knight g3 and harass the queen, but I wasn't sure what the follow-up there would be. And yet another idea would be to go rook g1 and try to double rooks on the g-file. So a lot of considerations here, and it's one of these positions that's very rich, but it's not, you're not sure what the right way to go is. I opted for knight c5. I thought, you know what, I should just put maximum pressure and strain on this, on these queenside pawns, and maybe eventually my opponent would break. But you know, he kind of held solid. He went rook fd8, you know, again shoring up the knight on d5 and also getting out of the knight d7 fork threat. And then I went a3, kind of teasing minority attack with b4. And then knight f5, good move. Now that this knight is really secure and well defended, this knight on e7 kind of didn't have much to do anymore. Now this knight is trying to roam and create some play on the king side. And note that e4 here is very, very risky because, knight takes d4 would come with a tempo, and it's just a very double-edged position. Now, I went queen d1 because I didn't want to go for it, but let's take a look at e4. If e4, it's a, double attack, and knight takes d4, right? And queen, where's the queen go? Well, that's the problem, actually. Because I want to attack this knight on d4, but the issue is that if knight takes f4 comes, then this rook is protecting it. So I would need to put the queen on a square where it's both attacking the knight and defending the f4 pawn, and I don't see it. I do not see it. So I just didn't want to go for this line. So I went queen d1, and frankly, I didn't even consider playing e4 a very long time because it just seemed too tactically suspicious, and I do respect Levy's tactical ability, so I just was not about that. After queen d1, I wanted to get the queens off the board, and I think continued to pressure on the queen side. He had other ideas and went queen h4, saying, no, we're not going to trade queens. And then here I actually have to ask the question again, why not e4? Because I could potentially fork these pieces, and now my queen on d1 is protecting the pawn on d4. And I must tell you, I did not go for it. I actually went for queen f3, just shoring up my king side even more. But let's look again. If e4, knight takes f4 now as an option. And after e takes f5, I just thought, you know what, there might be something tough here because now there's knight takes g2, king takes g2, and rook takes d4. And I thought, I don't know, this is very, very sharp, very, very tricky position. Now I am a piece up, and that does matter, but I just wasn't very sure about the consequences of my king being so naked on g2. And this line probably isn't forced. There might be other opportunities for black here as well. So I opted against it. Anyways, instead I went queen f3, and then black went queen e7 and relocated the queen backwards. And I thought that made a lot of sense because now knight h4 is actually a threat, getting rid of my strong fianchettoed bishop. So I thought that was a good idea. I went rook g1 anyway because I thought, you know what, there's no real good way to stop knight h4. So I thought at least I'll tease out pressure on g7. So I was like, you know what, you can get my bishop, but now if you do, I'm going to have nice pressure on the g file after recapture. Knight h4 happened anyway, and after queen g3, knight takes g2, and rook takes g2. And this was my idea, I was like, okay, you traded on the g file, you got my bishop, kudos to you, but now I'm going to shift gears and create some type of Alekhines gun on the g file that you have to worry about. Black played g6 to just deal with the checkmate threat. And now I actually went queen f3. And my idea with queen f3 was to kind of replace the fianchettoed bishop that was on g2 and influencing this diagonal. So the point was to kind of constrain black from thinking about pushing the b pawn because this diagonal could be very loose and my knight might have targets here. The other idea was, in many positions, when you do have the Alekhines gun, you don't want to lead with the queen because the queen is the most valuable piece. So I wanted to lead with my rooks, potentially, to get some type of play on the g file, not with my queen. Black played b6 anyway, and this was actually a huge surprise to me, and I think very good tactical awareness on the part of Levy. Point is that I can take the a6 pawn, but if I do after knight takes a6, my knight is actually kind of trapped. And after rook a8, the only square to secure my knight would be knight b4 back, and this way black recovers his pawn with interest because b2 is hanging, and now you could make an argument that my king is less secure than black's king. So I didn't want to go for that line, and I think b6 was a really reasonable move, just showing that, there was actually play for black on the queen side. I went knight d3 back. I thought that at least now the b pawn is moved, the c pawn is weak, so I thought now I can relocate to e5 and put more pressure on it. But now he went c5, and again, c5 is a good move because Now he's arguing that, okay, my pawn on C, the C pawn was weak for sure, but are you going to really allow the B rook to be active and the D rook to come alive, and all my pieces are active on the queen side? Do you really want to allow that? And in my mind, I was like, no, I don't want to allow that. I don't want to allow that, but I don't think I can allow C takes D4 because that ruins my structure. So I went knight E5, and fortunately, knight E5 threatens a fork, so for the time being, C takes D4 is not an issue. Note that if C takes D4 and knight C6, the queen can move to C7 and temporarily pin my rook on C1, but then I actually have rook G1, and the point is now my rook on C1 is covered, and I'm ready to take one of the rooks on the next move. So after knight E5, black went rook BC8, now sufficiently defending the C pawn and stopping knight C6 threats. And I thought, you know what? Black is pretty much equalized. Black has done very, very well to equalize this game. I have spoiled my pawn structure with this double pawns, and my hope was to get counterplay on the king side and constrain black's pawn breaks. But now that black's king is relatively secure and he's managed to play C5, I think there's no advantage here. So we're on equal footing and a new game began. I went rook G1, again tactically not allowing C takes D4 for the time being because I have knight C6, which is a fork. So black went queen E8 to cover the C6 square. And here I finally said, you know what, I've done all I can do holding this tension on the pawn. So I went D takes C5. And at least here, after D takes C5, because the queen stepped off of the E line, or off of the E7 square, black will have split pawns in some way, shape, or form. Because if you take with the rook, I'll play rook takes, and then there'll potentially be split pawns. And if you take with the B pawn, they're split pawns. So I did feel, at least pawn structure-wise, I might have a target on the queen side. Rook takes C5 was played. I took on C5. And after B takes E5, I went rook D1. And I thought, okay, the position is probably equal, but at least I have something to play for based on the fact these pawns were split. If this C pawn, for instance, was on B7, there would be pretty much nothing to play for. I think it'd be very equal. Here it is also very equal, but at least I have some targets to play with. So I was not thinking about, I thought the game was still going to continue for some time. Black played rook B8, good move. At least because the pawns are split, black has a open file to deal with. So just a good way to get some counterplay is to sometimes ignore your weaknesses and just try to attack whites. I went rook D2 to cover that pawn. And then black went queen B5. And queen B5 is a very, very cheeky move because you'll notice that there is a mate on one threat. Very, very, very cheeky. Can you imagine if I played a move like rook C2 and allowed queen F1? That would be crazy, right? So I did see that threat, and I went king G2 to cover that F1 square. And here's probably the critical position of the game because you have a situation where I've managed to cover my B2 pawn. My king is tucked away for now. And, there seems to be pressure on my queen side, but at the same time, I've managed to cover it, and maybe I can get something going on the king side. So black has to be very, very alert and figure out a way to kind of neutralize my potential ideas because I'm thinking about maybe playing H4 and H5. I'm also thinking about maybe knight G4 and relocating it like this. In some positions, maybe even E4 becomes a move. So black has to make some smart decisions here. Black went for queen A4, trying to get the rook involved on the B line and maybe think about getting the queen back to safety on the 8th rank just to get the queen closer to the king. Because you will find in a lot of situations that when a queen strays from its king, that's when the decisive attack happens. But already here I thought, you know what, I might have something to play for, and I went for F5. And F5 was basically a consequence of this queen being far away. If the queen was close to the king, I don't think this move would even be viable. But because it was, I thought, here's my chance. And here was the initial the idea. If G takes F5 is played, well, Queen G3 check wins on the spot, because if King H8, there's Knight takes F7 mate, a very, very cool looking mate. And if King F8, there's actually Knight D7 check. And now you can see that the rook is under fire by 2 pieces. So after Queen takes D7, Queen takes B8 check, White is actually up a exchange. And so after F5, the pawn is actually immune. And because while it's immune, I can put more pressure on the position because I'm threatening something like F takes E6 and Queen takes F7. So I was very, very happy to find this move because it just gave me a little bit of counterplay in this position when the queen was far from the nest. And note that E takes F5, of course, is not playable because Queen takes D5 and I win a piece. So the pawn is immune. Black went for Rook F8, a good move, defending the F7 pawn because you can't allow the queen to invade on F7. And I went F takes E6 because I thought that now I have to try and at least create a weakness in Black's camp. So I went F takes E6, F takes E6, and Queen G4. And here I was happy because now we have a scenario where Black has 4 pawn islands, right? 1, 2, 3, and then 4, right? So Black has 4 pawn islands to my 3 pawn islands. And in an endgame, these pawns might be difficult to defend. So that was my idea. Is now I can maybe go to work in an endgame where I have a slightly better pawn structure. So Queen G4 also threatens E6 and the queen. So it seemed pretty advisable to trade queens because the alternative Queen E8 is extremely passive. So Queen takes G4 was played, Knight takes G4, and now is my time to try and go to work and take advantage of these weaknesses. Black played C4. I think it's a good move, trying to get rid of one of the weaknesses and threaten C3. I went Rook D4, attacking that pawn. I can't really stop the trade of the pawns. I thought that if I went Rook C2, now Rook C8 would be played, and now C3 again is an idea, so I didn't think I could stop it. So that's why I went Rook D4. Point being that if Black plays C3 now, I thought I could take on C3, and after Knight takes, go Rook D6, which is a double attack on these pawns. So instead, after Rook D4, Black played Rook C8, defending that pawn, trying to push C3, I guess, and actually recapture with the Rook. So that, I think, is the idea. And I went Knight E5, goading Black into C3, and activating my Knight on an active square where it's eyeing the king side, and, just eyeing a lot of squares. C3 was played. I think it's a forced move, just, trying to liquidate that pawn before it gets captured. And after B takes C3 and Rook takes C3, Black has actually done well to trade and get rid of one of his weaknesses. And so now that we both have 3 pawn islands, but I have a slightly more activity than Black. And I try to take advantage of that with Rook A4. Normally you don't want the rook in front of the pawn. You want it behind the pawn. But here you can see my rook is defending and attacking. So Rook A4 is a nice move. And the other thing is this knight controls the one square that the rook can come back to defend. So really, really nice multi-purpose move. Knight C7 defends that pawn. But now the knight on C7 is in a relatively defensive position. And it allows me to continue with my counterplay. I went King F3. Note that no piece in endgame is off limits, and especially the king. The king needs to get active to really make something happen here. So now my thought process was, okay, maybe I can move the king up the board and influence the game in some way while the knight is passive. King G7 was played. Good move. Also, Black's having intentions of activating his king. And now H4. Very, very important move. The point is that now I'm trying to maximize all my pieces. You see, my rook is pretty much doing a decent job here. My knight is doing a reasonable job stopping Rook C6. My king is creeping forward. And now I need to push this H-pawn to create some more play on the king side and to control some important squares. Knight B5 was played, and I think Knight B5 is a sign a little bit of some frustration because if if you play a move like king f6, you know, my knight is under fire, but maybe my knight starts dancing around with a move like knight d7 check, or even knight g4 check. And these lines are just tough to calculate, especially when you're in some time trouble, which Levy was in. So h4, you know, I'm slowly improving my piece, and black really wants to do the same, but because I have a little bit more space and black's really in a defensive position, it's hard to just keep improving. So I think knight b5 was this frustration on black's part and saying, you know what, I want to resolve the game quickly. I want to resolve the tension quickly instead of holding the defensive position, and it probably would have been better to hold the defensive position. Now a3 pawn is attacked, so I do have to do something, and I decided to go rook takes a6 because I didn't think I could hold this pawn anymore. Note that a move like knight c4 is extremely, extremely passive, and again, kind of a step in the wrong direction. So rook takes a6, rook takes a3, and here I actually realized, actually a little bit too late, that I can't take the e6 pawn. You know, it's a very, very, you know, pretty obvious nuance, but I just missed a few moves ago that knight d4 check, you know, just wins my rook because I'm pinned. So I was kind of frustrated here because I was like, man, I'm not even winning a pawn here, and black was able to liquidate. Geez, this is not good. But the one thought process I did have was that, you know, right now I'm a little bit more active than white, and now that, you know, these pieces are kind of off sides, I need to take advantage of that. So I start with rook b6, challenging this knight on b5, and once it moves, maybe I could take on e6, but also thinking about rook b7 check. And the point being is this king is a little bit airy with these pieces off sides. Knight d4 check was played, good move, and I played king e4, stepping up, and now knight f5, and it seems like black is very, very close to holding the game because, you know, this knight is actually threatening h4. I can't really effectively save the pawn. There's also rook a4 check, which is annoying. And, you know, if I play rook takes e6, it's just a trade, which, you know, would liquidate. So I did not want to liquidate. I wanted to create a little bit of magic in the position. And so instead of taking on e6, I went rook b7 check. And the idea with this move is just asking the king, what are you going to do? Because if you go back to g8, you're cut off. And, you know, my rook on the 7th rank could be very dangerous. But if you go to h6, your king also feels a little bit cut off there. It turns out that king h6 is actually a very viable move. Point being that after a move like knight g4 check, which is what I probably would have played, black can step up to h5. And note that there is no checkmate because the knight is actually hanging. And if you check me again, the king can run up the board and take this pawn, and now it has the g5 square, and black is just managing to survive. Now, I think I still would have some pressure here, but black is surviving, and that's important. Instead of playing king h6, black went for the natural king g8. But king g8 is a little bit too passive because now this king has to be worried about constant threats of check, but also of me getting some other piece in the game to challenge that king. And here was my chance, and I took it. I went king f4. Not going for the e6 pawn, not even trying to defend the h4 pawn, but trying to walk my king in the game. And this is a very, very nasty move, and I think it's just very, very difficult to stop. I mean, if you play h6, for instance, you drop the g6 pawn, and now my king has a new highway to f6. And so there's really no way to stop my king from getting to f6. And I'm not sure if the position is completely winning, but I think practically speaking, it's very, very difficult to handle. Black went knight takes h4, but unfortunately, that actually accelerates my journey to the f6 square because now I get to play king g5 with tempo. And note that now this knight is hanging, king f6 is coming, and once the king comes to f6, rook b8 mate is an idea. Black played rook a5, pinning this knight, and noting that if I go king takes h4, then blacks up a pawn after rook takes e5. But again, this knight on h4 was not the prize. The f6 square was the prize. And after king f6, my king manages to just walk into the backyard of black's king and just have the audacity to threaten checkmate. And the other thing that's kind of annoying is this king now is very, very secure on the f6 square. Note that their king is 2 diagonals away from the knight, and when that's the case, it means that it would take 3 moves to get a check. And so I was keenly aware of this geometry of if you're 2 diagonals away from the knight, you can't be harassed for a while. And so I knew that here I was going to have some time to drum up some counterplay. And the immediate threat is just rook b8 mate. So really difficult to deal with it. The only move is rook a8 defending that mate. But now I played rook g7 check. And the issue is you can't go to the corner with king h8 because knight f7 mate. And so the king has to go to f8. But after king f8, now there are multiple ways to win, but the easiest one is just rook takes h7. And the issue is I'm attacking this knight with tempo, but also threatening rook h8 mate. And in this position, Levy resigned. He'd seen enough because I'm just winning a piece and I'm still threatening checkmate. Very, very interesting game. I was very happy to win it because it was a very unusual middle game structure. These double pawns in the F line were kind of confusing. And I thought I was doing pretty well constraining black from, getting these breaks on the queen side. But all of a sudden, black had equalized, gotten off the c5 break, and I had to drum up some counterplay. And this f5 move, this pawn sacrifice with f5 was the key that kind of, turned the game a little bit, because just at the moment when black's heavy pieces, the queen was on a4 and the rook was on b8, were just slightly off sides, I was able to get some pressure on the king, and it proved to be a little bit too much for Levy to handle. All right, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Please like and or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, you can do so by making a contribution in the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks.